The rain was coming down hard that night, hitting the metal roof of the small garage like 1,000 tiny drums. It was one of those cold, wet Tuesdays where the air feels heavy and all you want to do is go home, put on dry socks, and forget about the world. Inside the shop, the air smelled of old oil, rubber, and the stale coffee that had been sitting in the pot for far too long. Frank wiped his hands on a dirty rag, looking around the empty bay. It had been a slow week. Actually, it had been a slow year. He walked over to the small desk in the corner, cluttered with invoices and unpaid bills. The stack was getting higher, and his bank account was getting lower. He picked up a red envelope marked Final Notice and felt that familiar tightness in his chest. This garage wasn't just a business to him, it was his father's legacy. It was the place where he had learned how to fix his first carburetor when he was just a kid. But now, with the rent going up and customers scarce, the dream of keeping it alive was slipping through his fingers like sand. He sighed heavily, rubbing his tired eyes. It was past 10 o'clock. He decided to call it a night, lock up, and try to drown his worries in front of the television. Frank grabbed his jacket and walked toward the big rolling door at the front. He was just about to reach for the light switch when a sound cut through the noise of the rain. It was a deep, rumbling growl of an engine. It sounded powerful, expensive, and fast. He squinted through the glass window of the door. A single headlight cut through the darkness, and a sleek, dark motorcycle came speeding down the street. Frank watched, assuming the rider would just pass by. But as the bike hit the puddle right in front of the driveway, there was a loud pop, followed immediately by the hiss of escaping steam. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The motorcycle coasted for a few more feet and rolled to a stop right in the middle of the entrance, blocking the gate. Frank stood there for a moment, annoyed. He was tired, he was stressed, and he really didn't want to deal with a breakdown right now. He thought about pretending he wasn't there, turning off the lights, and hiding. But he knew he couldn't do that. He was a mechanic, and helping people was in his blood. He cursed under his breath, flipped the switch to open the heavy bay door, and stepped out into the cold rain. The rider was still sitting on the bike, trying to restart it. He was wearing a heavy black helmet and a leather riding suit that looked soaked through. The engine wouldn't turn over, it just made a clicking sound. Frank walked up to him, shouting over the rain. "Hey! You need a hand." The rider stopped kicking the starter and turned his head. Even through the rain and the dark visor, Frank could sense the guy was calm. He gave a simple nod and climbed off the bike. Together, they pushed the heavy machine into the garage. The weight of it surprised Frank. This wasn't some cheap street bike. It was a beast of a machine, custom built with parts that looked expensive. Once they got it inside, out of the downpour, the rider shook off some water. He reached up and unlatched his helmet, pulling it off to reveal a face that was plastered on movie posters all over the world. It was Keanu Reeves? Frank froze for a second. He recognized the actor immediately, the famous action star, the guy from the movies about shooting bad guys and driving fast cars. But Frank was so tired and the situation was so bizarre that his brain just sort of shrugged it off. He figured it couldn't actually be him, or maybe it was just a guy who looked exactly like him. Frank decided to treat him like any other customer. He didn't want to be the weird fan making a scene if it turned out to be some look-alike. Keanu ran a hand through his wet hair and let out a breath. He didn't act like a celebrity at all. He stood there, looking down at his bike with genuine concern, like a worried father looking at a sick child. "I'm really sorry to barge in so late," Keanu said. His voice was soft and polite. She just doesn't like the rain, I guess. I hope I didn't get you into any trouble. Frank shook his head and grabbed a flashlight. No trouble. Just glad I hadn't locked the door yet. I was actually heading out, but this sounded like it needed help. Frank crouched down next to the bike, shining the light at the engine. To his surprise, Keanu crouched down right next to him. He wasn't standing back and barking orders or checking his watch. He was interested. He watched everything Frank did. It looks like a spark plug issue, Frank muttered, reaching for his tools. Or maybe the coil got wet. He started to loosen a few bolts, his hands moving by memory. As Frank worked, the silence of the garage filled the air, broken only by the sound of the rain on the roof and the clinking of metal tools. Frank couldn't help himself, he started talking. It was a habit he had when he was nervous or stressed. You know, she's a beautiful machine, Frank said, patting the gas tank gently. But these high-performance bikes, they're sensitive. They need constant attention. Unlike my old truck out back, which just keeps going no matter what I do to it. Keanu smiled at that. Yeah, she's a bit high maintenance. But she's worth it when she runs. Frank tightened a bolt and wiped some grease from his fingers. I bet. I wish I could afford to keep a machine like this running. To be honest, I'm just trying to keep the lights on in this place right now. The words slipped out before Frank could stop them. He hadn't meant to complain to a customer, especially this one. But the weight of the bills was sitting on his shoulders. Keanu looked at Frank, his expression turning serious. He looked around the garage, noticing the peeling paint on the walls and the stacks of dusty parts in the corner. It's tough keeping a shop open these days, Keanu said quietly. People don't fix things like they used to. They just replace them. That's the truth, Frank said, feeling a bit of relief that the stranger understood. I grew up here. My dad built this place. But lately, it feels like the world is moving too fast for an old mechanic like me. He stopped working for a moment and looked at his hands, black with oil. I'm probably boring you with my problems. You just want your bike fixed. Keanu shook his head. Not at all. I think it's important to care about what you do. It's rare to find someone who really loves their work. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wad of cash. Listen, I don't want you to worry about the cost. Just take your time and do what you do best. I'm in no rush. Frank looked at the money and then back at the bike. He didn't take the cash yet. Just give me 10 minutes. I think I can get her purring again. He went back to work with a bit more energy. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about the fact that this guy, this famous actor who could be anywhere in the world, was standing in a cold garage, listening to his story and treating him with respect. Frank grabbed a rag and wiped down a part, feeling a strange sense of calm that he hadn't felt in months. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a night that would change his life completely. The work on the motorcycle was harder than Frank expected. The rain had made everything slippery, and the engine of the bike was packed in tighter than a sardine can. Frank was lying on a creeper board, sliding under the exhaust pipe, trying to reach a stubborn bolt that just wouldn't budge. His knuckles were already raw, and grease was smudged across his forehead. Above him, he heard the sound of boots shifting on the concrete floor. He expected the famous actor to be pacing, checking his phone, or maybe acting impatient like most wealthy customers did when they had to wait. But Keanu wasn't doing any of that. When Frank slid back out from under the bike to grab a different wrench, he saw Keanu crouching down by the rear wheel. He wasn't looking at his watch. He was looking at the suspension with genuine interest, studying the machinery as if he were trying to memorize how it was put together. When Keanu saw Frank looking at him, he didn't stand up or act embarrassed. He just pointed at a spring near the brake. "The damping on this seems a little soft for city riding," Keanu said softly. "Do you think that's why it felt a bit loose on the turn back there?" Frank blinked. He wasn't used to customers knowing what a damper was, let alone noticing if it felt loose on a turn. He sat up, wiping his hands on his pants. "You've got a good eye," Frank said, a note of respect creeping into his voice. "Yeah, the settings are off. If you want, I can tighten that up while I'm down here. It won't cost you extra." Keanu shook his head and smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes from someone who has seen a lot of the world, but it was warm. "I appreciate that. I love this bike, but I'm still learning all its moods." For the next hour, the garage didn't feel like a place of business anymore. It felt like two friends hanging out. Frank went back to work on the engine, and Keanu stayed right there with him. At one point, the light hanging over the engine flickered and died, leaving them in shadows. Before Frank could even get up to grab a stepladder, Keanu had reached up and unscrewed the bulb. He walked over to the bench, found a replacement in Frank's messy pile of spare parts, and screwed it in without being asked. "You didn't have to do that, man," Frank said, feeling a little awkward that a movie star was changing his light bulbs. Keanu just shrugged. "We need to see what we're doing, right? Besides, it's nice to work with my hands. It's grounding." Something about that word grounding made Frank feel comfortable enough to open up. He had been holding in his stress for months, pretending everything was fine for his wife and kids, but the pressure was crushing him. He leaned back against the workbench, holding a wrench loosely in his hand, and looked at the rainy night outside the open bay door. "Honestly, I wish I could just enjoy the work like you do," Frank admitted, his voice dropping a little. "Lately, every time I pick up a tool, I just see a bill I can't pay. The bank sent a notice last week. If I don't come up with the back rent by the end of the month, they're locking this place up. My dad built this shop with his own hands. It feels like I'm failing him." The garage went quiet for a moment. Usually, when Frank complained to customers, they would nod politely and look away, uncomfortable with the sadness. But Keanu didn't look away. He looked right at Frank, his face serious and attentive. He didn't offer empty platitudes like it'll all work out or everything happens for a reason. He just listened. "That is a heavy weight to carry," Keanu said quietly. He leaned against the workbench next to Frank, looking at the floor. "I've lost things that mattered to me. Things I thought I could never replace. The fear of losing the memories attached to a place, that's harder than losing the place itself. You aren't just fighting for a building, Frank. You're fighting for your father's legacy. That is honorable." Frank felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know much about Keanu's personal life, but he could tell the man wasn't just acting. He meant what he said. It was strange how a stranger could understand his grief better than his own neighbors did. "I just don't know if I can fight it anymore," Frank whispered. "I'm tired." "Sometimes," Keanu said, "you just need to get through the night. Then you fight the next day. One day at a time." He clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder. It was a heavy, reassuring grip. "You're a good mechanic. This place, it has a soul." Not many shops have that anymore. Just then, the headlights of a car swept across the front windows. A young guy, maybe 20 years old, pulled up right outside the door, blocking the entrance. He wasn't there to fix a car. He had his phone up, recording video. He walked right into the open bay door, his eyes wide. "Oh my God!" the kid shouted, his voice echoing in the metal shop. "You're him. You're John Wick. Can I get a selfie? Can I get a video for my TikTok?" Frank tensed up. He worried the piece they had found was shattered. He stepped forward, ready to tell the kid to get out, but Keanu held up a hand gently. He didn't look angry. He walked toward the kid, putting himself between the kid and Frank, almost as if he were protecting Frank's privacy. Keanu smiled at the young guy, but it wasn't the same smile he gave Frank. It was polite but distant. "Hey, buddy. Listen, I'm really sorry, but I can't do any photos right now. My friend here," he nodded toward Frank, "is doing me a huge favor fixing my bike in the middle of the night. I don't want to disturb his shop or take up his time. I hope you understand." The kid looked disappointed, but he nodded. Yeah, sure. No problem. That's cool." He backed away, still recording, and retreated to his car. Frank watched the interaction, stunned. Most stars would have posed and left. Keanu had used the moment to deflect attention onto Frank and the work, calling him a friend and emphasizing the favor. It was a small thing, but it made Frank feel 10 feet tall. Once the car drove away, Keanu walked back over to the bike. "Sorry about that," he muttered. "Don't apologize," Frank said quickly. "Comes with the territory, I guess. Being famous." He tightened the last bolt on the engine cover and wiped his hands one last time. "All right. Let's see if she starts." Frank climbed on the bike, turned the key, and hit the ignition. The engine roared to life instantly, a deep, throaty sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It purred like a kitten, smooth and steady. Frank revved it once, just to hear the music, then killed the engine. "She sounds perfect," Frank said, feeling a wave of pride. "Better than she probably has in years." Keanu walked over and ran his hand along the seat, a look of pure joy on his face. "That sounds amazing. You really know what you're doing, Frank." He walked over to the small desk where Frank kept his invoice book. Frank picked up a pen and scribbled down a price. It was a standard repair fee. He tore the page out and handed it to Keanu, mentally deciding that he would waive the extra labor charge for the time they spent talking. It was the least he could do after the kind words about his dad. Keanu looked at the number. He pulled out his wallet, a battered old leather thing that looked like it had been through the wars, and started counting out bills. He placed them on the desk. Then, he looked at the invoice again and frowned. "This is too low," he said. "What? No, that's the standard rate," Frank argued. "It didn't take that long. Quality work is worth more than the standard rate," Keanu said firmly. He added several more bills to the pile on the desk. "And I appreciate you staying open. Please, take it." He pushed the money toward Frank, his eyes locking with Frank's, daring him to refuse. Frank picked up the cash. It was significantly more than the bill, but not so much that it felt like charity. It felt like respect. Frank nodded slowly. "Thank you, Keanu." "Really?" "No," Keanu said, zipping up his jacket and pulling his helmet back on. "Thank you. You saved my night." He revved the engine one last time, gave Frank a two-finger salute from the handlebars, and accelerated out into the rain. Frank watched the tail lights fade down the street, the stack of money still in his hand. He felt lighter than he had in months, but deep down, he also felt a strange sense of finality, as if he had just met a ghost who was destined to haunt his dreams. He turned back to the desk, ready to close up, unaware that their night wasn't over yet. The roar of the engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise itself. Frank stood alone in the center of the garage, the smell of exhaust and burnt rubber still hanging in the cool air. He looked at the empty doorway where the tail lights had just disappeared, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt like he had just dreamt the whole thing. A part of him wondered if he had just fixed a stranger's bike or if he had actually spent an hour talking to one of the most famous actors on the planet. He walked slowly back to the cluttered desk where Keanu had left the money. The pile of bills sat there, stark and real against the greasy surface of the invoice book. Frank sat down on his creaky stool and picked up the cash. It was more than double what he had asked for. He smoothed the bills out with his thumb, counting them once, then twice. It was enough. It was enough to cover the overdue rent for the shop and maybe, just maybe, put a decent dinner on the table for the family for a week. A lump formed in his throat, hard and sudden. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was the biggest tip he had ever received in his life, but it wasn't the money that got to him, it was the way the man had looked at him, like he was a peer, like he mattered. Frank shoved the money into his pocket, the fabric of his jeans feeling tighter against his leg, as if the weight of the cash was physical. He stood up and began the ritual of closing down the shop. He turned off the main overhead lights, plunging the garage into shadows, leaving only the small safety lamp glowing near the back exit. He swept up the metal shavings and the dirty rags, his movements automatic. His mind was racing, replaying the conversation over and over. He kept thinking about what Keanu had said regarding the soul of the shop. For months, Frank had looked at this place as a burden, a sinking ship. But tonight, looking at the vintage tools on the wall and the old photos of his father taped to the locker, he saw it differently. He saw the history. He locked the heavy bay door and double-checked the padlock. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the city streets glistening under the yellow glow of the street lamps. Frank walked to his truck, an old pickup that rattled when he turned the key. He usually dreaded the drive home, knowing that he would be walking into a house filled with stress and unpaid bills. But tonight, the truck felt a little lighter, the engine sounded a little smoother. As he drove through the quiet streets, he let the window down just an inch. The cool night air hit his face, waking him up. He thought about his wife, Elena, waiting at home. She was probably asleep on the couch again, waiting for him to come home so she could sleep soundly. They hadn't talked much about the shop lately because every conversation ended in an argument about money. They were drowning, and neither of them knew how to swim. He patted his pocket where the cash was. This didn't fix everything, but it plugged the leak in the boat for now. It bought them time. When Frank pulled into the driveway of their small suburban house, all the lights were off except for the porch light. He sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the window. He felt a sudden surge of guilt. Why should a stranger have to save him? He was the man of the house. He was the one supposed to be providing. He took a deep breath, grabbed his toolbox, and walked inside. The house was quiet, filled with the soft breathing sounds of his two kids sleeping in the back rooms. Elena was indeed curled up on the sofa, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The TV was playing the news on mute. Frank set his keys down gently on the kitchen counter and walked over to her. He watched her face, relaxed in sleep but creased with worry lines even then. He felt a wave of love so strong it hurt. He knelt down beside the sofa and brushed a stray hair away from her face. "Elena," he whispered softly. Her eyes fluttered open. For a second, she looked panicked, the anxiety of their life instantly returning, but when she saw Frank, she relaxed. "You're late," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Frank whispered, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Everything is okay. Actually, something good happened." Elena sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Good. Did you sell the Mustang?" She was referring to the classic car project Frank had been working on for years, hoping to sell it for a profit. "No, not the Mustang," Frank said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wad of bills. He didn't count it in front of her, he just placed it in her hand. "I had a late customer. A movie star, actually. Keanu Reeves?" His bike broke down. Elena looked at the money, then at Frank, her eyes wide with confusion. "Keanu Reeves, the actor." "Frank, are you sure you aren't dreaming?" "I thought I was too," Frank laughed softly, sitting on the edge of the coffee table. "But he was there, Elena. He helped me fix the bike. He listened to me. We talked about Dad. And he gave me this." He nodded to the cash. "It's more than the repair cost." "It's enough, Elena. It's enough for the rent." Elena's hands trembled as she looked at the money. She didn't cry immediately, she just looked at it with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Then, she looked up at Frank, and tears started to spill over. "We can pay the bank," she whispered. "We can pay them," Frank confirmed, taking her hand. "We're safe for this month." They sat there in the dim light of the living room for a long time, just holding hands. It was the first moment of peace they had shared in months. The crushing weight that had been sitting on Frank's chest since the first foreclosure notice arrived was finally lifting, just enough for him to breathe. He told her about the conversation, about how Keanu had treated the shop with respect, and how he had defended Frank from the kid with the phone. He told her about the light bulb. Elena listened, squeezing his hand, a look of wonder on her face. "I always liked his movies," she said quietly. "But he sounds like a good man in real life, too." "He is," Frank agreed. "He's just a guy riding a bike in the rain, same as me." Eventually, they convinced themselves to go to bed. As Frank lay under the covers, staring at the ceiling, he expected to be too wired to sleep. But instead, a profound exhaustion took over. It wasn't the tiredness of stress, but the satisfied tiredness of a hard day's work recognized. He drifted off thinking about the sound of the motorcycle engine purring in his garage. The next morning, Frank woke up to the smell of coffee and eggs. The sun was shining through the blinds, a rarity after a storm. The house felt different. The air felt lighter. He walked into the kitchen to see Elena making breakfast, humming a tune she hadn't hummed in ages. The kids were awake, bickering over cereal, a sound that usually annoyed Frank but now made him smile. They were safe. The shop was safe. Frank kissed Elena on the cheek and poured himself a cup of coffee. He felt like he could take on the world today. He grabbed his keys and headed out to the truck, ready to open the shop and face whatever challenges the day threw at him. The drive to the garage felt different, too. The city looked brighter, the traffic didn't bother him. He pulled up to the shop and stepped out, whistling. He was reaching for the padlock on the bay door when he froze. There, tucked neatly under the door handle, was a plain white envelope. It wasn't there when he left last night, he would have seen it. He looked around the street, but it was empty. The morning rush was just beginning, but nobody was paying attention to him. With a curious frown, Frank pulled the envelope from the handle. It was thick, heavy, and sealed. His name, Frank, was written on the front in a hurried, sharp handwriting. His heart skipped a beat. He recognized that handwriting from the invoice book last night. He ripped the envelope open. The check inside wasn't made out to cash or just a blank amount. It was a cashier's check, made out directly to the bank that held the mortgage on the garage. Frank's eyes scanned down to the amount at the bottom. He had to look 3 times to make sure he was reading the numbers right. It wasn't just the rent money. It was the full balance. The entire debt. Paid in full. Frank stumbled back against the brick wall of the shop, the check trembling in his hands. He looked down the street, in the direction Keanu had ridden off the night before. The shock hit him so hard he had to sit down on the curb. He wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just a tipper. He was a guardian angel in a leather jacket. Frank looked up at the sky, laughing through tears of pure disbelief, realizing that the ride last night wasn't just about a broken bike. It was about a broken life being fixed, and the mechanic wasn't the only one who knew how to repair something. Frank sat on the cold curb outside his shop, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The check in his hand felt heavy, as if it were made of lead instead of paper. He looked at the numbers again, blinking rapidly, half expecting them to vanish into thin air. But they remained stubbornly real. It was the full amount. Every single cent of the debt that had been crushing his soul for the past year was gone, just wiped away with a single signature. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling a bit shaky. The morning sun was shining down on the street, the world waking up and going about its business, completely unaware of the miracle that had just taken place on this quiet sidewalk. A mail truck drove by, the driver waving casually. Frank lifted a hand to wave back, but he felt disconnected, like he was floating above the scene. He looked down at the envelope again. It was plain, ordinary. No fancy letterhead, no long note explaining why he had done it. Just the check and a few scrawled words on a sticky note attached to it, for the shop. Keep it running. K. Frank unlocked the garage and walked inside. The smell of oil and metal greeted him, usually a source of anxiety, but today it smelled like security. He walked over to the phone mounted on the wall, his hand trembling as he dialed the bank's number. The phone rang 4 times before a bored-sounding woman answered. Citibank, this is Nancy. How can I help you? Hi, my name is Frank. I own the auto shop on 4th Street. I need to check the balance on my commercial loan, Frank stammered. He answered the security questions, his voice gaining strength with every word. Then came the moment of truth. Nancy tapped on her keyboard, the clicking sound echoing in Frank's ear. Okay, Mr. Frank, she said. It looks like, wait, that can't be right. She paused, and Frank held his breath. According to my screen, a payment was processed early this morning. A cashier's check. It has cleared. The balance on your account is 0. Frank closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. 0. 0, sir, the woman confirmed, her voice changing from bored to surprised. You own the building free and clear, Mr. Frank. That is, congratulations. Frank hung up the phone. He didn't know whether to scream, shout, or dance. Instead, he just leaned his head against the cool wall and let the tears come. These weren't tears of sadness, but tears of pure, unadulterated relief. He thought of his father, who had poured his life into this place. He thought of Elena, who had been so scared of losing their home. And he thought of Keanu, the quiet, humble man who had ridden into the rain and out of their lives, leaving nothing but kindness behind. But Frank knew he couldn't just keep this to himself. He felt a burning need to see the man, to look him in the eye and say thank you properly, not just a quick nod in the dark. He remembered the conversation they had shared the night before. Keanu had mentioned he was in town for a few more days, staying at a hotel near the studio district. It was a long shot, but Frank had to try. He locked up the shop again, putting the back in 1 hour sign in the window, and jumped into his truck. He drove faster than he should have, his mind racing. He practiced what he would say in his head. You didn't have to do this. This is too much. But none of those words seemed enough. How do you thank someone for saving your legacy? Frank pulled up to the fancy hotel downtown. It was a towering glass structure, very different from the gritty brick garage he called home. He parked the truck and walked through the rotating doors into a lobby that smelled like expensive flowers and polished marble. He felt out of place in his grease-stained jeans and work boots. The security guards near the elevator looked at him with raised eyebrows. Frank walked up to the front desk. The receptionist was a young man with a perfectly styled haircut and a suit that probably cost more than Frank's truck. "Can I help you, sir?" the receptionist asked, his smile polite but guarded. "Yeah, hi," Frank said, wiping his palms on his pants. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need to leave a message for one of your guests." "Keanu Reeves?" The receptionist's smile didn't falter, but his eyes became dismissive. "I'm sorry, sir. We cannot give out room numbers or disturb our guests. I can take a message, and if they choose, housekeeping will deliver it." Frank nodded. He expected this. "Okay, I get it. Just, please make sure he gets this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, greasy nut-a-bolt cover from the motorcycle he had fixed the night before. He had cleaned it as best he could, but it still smelled of the shop. "Tell him it's from the mechanic. He'll know." The receptionist looked at the bolt with confusion, then sighed and placed it in an envelope. "I'll see what I can do." Frank turned to leave. He felt foolish. The movie star was probably sleeping in a penthouse suite, enjoying his morning coffee, not caring about a mechanic wandering around the lobby. Frank walked back toward the glass doors, his head down. He was almost at the exit when a voice called out, "Frank." He froze. He knew that voice. He turned around slowly. Standing near the bank of elevators was Keanu. He wasn't wearing the leather riding gear. He was dressed simply in a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked tired, his hair messy, but his eyes were bright. Frank hurried over to him. "Keanu. He stumbled over his words. "I found the check. I went to the bank. It cleared." Keanu looked around, making sure no one was watching, and stepped closer to Frank. He lowered his voice. "Good. I was hoping you'd get that before the bank opened." "You can't do that," Frank said, his voice cracking. "That was too much money. I fixed a spark plug and changed a filter." "I didn't, that's a life's worth of money." "Frank," Keanu said, cutting him off gently. He put a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Last night, you told me about your father. You told me about the soul of that shop. That place is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a part of the city's history. It belongs to you." Keanu looked intensely into Frank's eyes. I have more money than I could ever spend. It's just paper to me. But to you, and to that shop, it's a future. Let me do this. Frank stood there, stunned by the logic. It was so simple, so pure. Why, Frank asked. Why me? Why not a charity? Why not some big foundation? Because charities have CEOs and overhead, Keanu said with a small shrug. You're just a guy working hard. You treated me like a human being, not a paycheck. You didn't know who I was, or you pretended not to. That's rare. You deserve a break, man. Everyone deserves a break sometimes. Frank looked at the actor. The media always painted pictures of celebrities being complicated or difficult, but the man standing in front of him was just a regular guy who wanted to help a neighbor. Frank realized then that refusing the gift would be insulting the gesture. It would be denying Keanu the joy of giving. Thank you, Frank whispered. I won't forget this. Ever. Take care of that shop, Keanu said, pulling his cap down lower. And keep fixing bikes. With that, Keanu turned and walked back toward the elevators, blending into the crowd before anyone else noticed who he was. Frank watched him go, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that the winter air outside couldn't touch. He walked out of the hotel, not as a desperate man, but as a man with a future. When Frank got back to his garage, Elena was there waiting for him. She had driven over as soon as he called her. She was standing in the middle of the floor, spinning around with her arms outstretched. We own it, Frank, she laughed, her voice echoing off the walls. We actually own it. Frank smiled, leaning against the doorframe. We do. And we're going to keep it going. That afternoon, Frank got back to work. A customer brought in an old sedan with a broken transmission. It was a messy, difficult job. Before today, Frank would have dreaded the labor and the low payout. But today, he whistled while he worked. He didn't just fix the car, he tuned the engine until it hummed like new. He replaced the wiper blades that hadn't been requested, and he vacuumed the floors, refusing to charge the customer a penny extra. When the old lady asked why he was being so generous, Frank just winked at her. Someone did a kindness for me recently, he said. I'm just passing it along. That was the real shock of what happened next. It wasn't just the money that Keanu had given, it was the hope. The shop didn't just look new, it felt new. Frank wasn't working to survive anymore, he was working to thrive. He hired a local kid who had been hanging around the shop looking for work, teaching him the trade the way his father had taught him. He started stocking better parts. He put a fresh coat of paint on the sign outside. The story of what happened that night didn't stay a secret for long. The old lady Frank helped told her son. The receptionist at the hotel told a blogger friend. Within a week, the story began to circulate online, a quiet whisper compared to the loud scandals of Hollywood. But to the people in the neighborhood, it was a legend. Frank looked at the empty bay stall where Keanu's bike had been. He thought about the rain, the late hour, and the simple conversation that had changed everything. It was a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or save the world on the big screen. Sometimes, they just ride a motorcycle, lend a hand, and change one person's world when nobody else is watching. And Frank vowed, as long as he drew breath, he would make sure that kindness was the engine that kept his world turning. 6 months passed, and the change in Frank's life wasn't just a slow fade, it was a complete transformation. The garage, once a place of dust and shadows, was now buzzing with life. Frank had finally taken the money he saved from not paying the mortgage and invested it back into the business. He had the exterior painted a bright, welcoming blue. He replaced the flickering neon sign with a new one that simply read Frank's Service, Old School Care. But the biggest change wasn't the paint or the lights. It was the feeling inside the shop. People in the neighborhood started talking. At first, it was just whispers at the local coffee shop. "Did you hear about Frank?" someone would ask. "Yeah, a movie star came in and saved his place." But as the weeks went by, the story grew. It became a local legend. What shocked the community wasn't just that Keanu Reeves had walked into their town, but that he had done it without cameras, without reporters, and without demanding a single thing in return. In a world where everything seemed to be a transaction or a publicity stunt, this pure act of kindness left people stunned. Because of the story, customers started coming from all over the city. They didn't just want their oil changed, they wanted to be a part of the place where the miracle happened. Frank was busier than he had ever been. He even hired an assistant, a quiet young kid named Danny who had been hanging around the shop for years, looking for a chance to learn. Frank was teaching him the trade the way his father had taught him: patience, respect for the machine, and honesty. One afternoon, Frank was under a car, explaining the intricacies of a brake system to Danny. "You see, son," Frank said, his voice echoing slightly from under the chassis, "anyone can buy a part. But knowing how to make it sing, that takes time. Don't rush it." Danny nodded, scribbling notes in a greasy notebook. "I know, Frank. It's just, people are always in such a hurry. They don't want to take the time. That's why this place is special," Frank replied, sliding out and wiping his forehead. "We take the time. Just like someone took the time for me." Frank stood up and walked to the front of the bay to look at the street. It was a beautiful, clear afternoon. The sun was reflecting off the hoods of the cars parked outside. Business was good, the bills were paid, and his family was happy. He felt a sense of peace he had never known before. But every now and then, he would look at the spot where Keanu had stood that rainy night, and he would wonder if he would ever see him again. He hoped so, not to ask for anything, but just to show him that the seed he had planted had grown into a garden. Around 4 o'clock, the distinct sound of a motorcycle engine echoed down the street. It wasn't the loud, aggressive roar of a sport bike, but the deep, rhythmic thumping of a classic machine. Frank's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked out to the curb, followed closely by Danny. The sleek motorcycle pulled up to the garage. It looked even better than the last time, the chrome shining in the sun. The rider killed the engine and kicked the stand down. He took off his helmet, shaking out his messy hair. It was Keanu. He looked a little older, maybe a little more tired, but his smile was exactly the same. Frank couldn't help but grin. "Well, look who it is. The prodigal actor returns." Keanu laughed, a warm and genuine sound. "Hey, Frank. I hope I'm not interrupting. I was just passing through and thought I'd check in on the place." Frank walked over and shook his hand, pumping it up and down. "Interrupting never. Come on in." He introduced Danny, whose eyes were wide with shock. Danny stammered a greeting, and Keanu treated him with the same seriousness he treated Frank, shaking his hand and asking him what he was learning. Keanu walked around the shop, looking at the new tools, the fresh paint, and the organization of the parts. "It looks great in here, Frank," he said, running his hand along a clean workbench. "It feels happy." "It is happy," Frank said. Because of you. I have to tell you, Keanu, the story got out. People know what you did. They come here now just to see the shop. You put us on the map, man. Keanu shook his head, looking a little embarrassed. I didn't do it for the map, Frank. I did it because you're a good man in a storm. The rest, that's just you. They talked for a while, standing among the cars. It wasn't about Hollywood or money. They talked about motorcycles, the weather, and how fast kids grow up. It felt comfortable, like catching up with an old brother. Before he left, Keanu walked over to a framed photo on the wall that Frank had put up, a black and white picture of his father standing in the same spot 30 years ago. Keanu looked at the photo for a long time. He'd be proud of you, Keanu said softly. I think he would be too, Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. I think he'd be shocked that John Wick is his guardian angel, but he'd be proud. Keanu chuckled. Yeah, he'd probably get a kick out of that. Before he rode away, Frank grabbed a set of keys from the wall. They were to a classic car project he had been working on, a muscle car that he had finally restored. Hey, Frank said. If you're ever in town and need to get away from the cameras, take this for a spin. It's fast. It handles like a dream. Just bring it back in one piece. Keanu looked at the keys, then at Frank. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just reached out and took Frank's hand, holding it with both of his. You are a good man, Frank. Don't ever let the world change that. I won't, Frank promised. Keanu put his helmet back on, fired up the engine, and gave a final wave. He rode off down the street, turning the corner and disappearing from view. Frank and Danny stood there, watching the empty road. Frank turned to his young apprentice. You see that, kid? Yeah, Danny breathed, still staring at the corner. I see it. That's how you do it, Frank said, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. You get successful, you get powerful, and you use it to lift people up. You don't look down on people. You help them fix what's broken. The story of the mechanic and the movie star didn't end with a credit roll. It rippled outward. Danny grew up to be one of the best mechanics in the city, always fair, always honest. Frank kept the shop running for another 20 years, never once forgetting the rainy night when his luck changed. But the real shock to everyone who heard the story wasn't the money. It was the lesson. People realized that heroes don't always look like the characters in the movies. Sometimes, a hero is just a guy who stops when he sees someone struggling. And sometimes, the person being helped is actually the one saving the hero's humanity. Frank spent the rest of his life paying that kindness forward. Every Christmas, he would anonymously repair cars for single mothers in the neighborhood. When a neighbor fell ill, Frank fixed their furnace for free. He never told a soul about the money. He just told the story of the kindness, and how it felt to be seen when he felt invisible. Years later, when Frank finally retired and closed the bay doors for the last time, he stood in the empty shop one final time. He looked at the spot where the bike had been, and he smiled. He realized that Keanu hadn't just paid his debts. He had given Frank a new purpose. He had shown him that no matter how dark the night gets, there is always a light, and sometimes, it's just a stranger with a broken bike and a heart of gold, willing to share the ride. And that, Frank decided, was the greatest ending any story could ever have.